start off with you saying that you have some recommendations, and then lean over and get them, and
Yeah.
then if you could just.
Yeah. I have written up what I think would be the sort of the draft amending motions and put them on my website. I'll read it out in its full. This would sort of be the statutory amendment. And in the Family Relations Act, which is the British Columbia statute, there are similar ones in each province, and the same thing in the Divorce Act. I start off by saying there would be in the British Columbia statute, by the addition of a new section in Part 2 under child custody, there would be the following phrase: there shall be a rebuttable presumption of shared parenting, period. Any judgment of a court that rebuts the presumption of shared parenting shall contain the reasons for the rebuttal and the evidence in support of the reasons. And then there would be an additional definition under Section 1, which defines shared parenting. Shared parenting means that the children of separated parents shall spend equal time with both parents. The following factors may not be taken into consideration by a court as rebutting the presumption of shared parenting. A, the lack of communication between the parents. B, allegations of stress on a child without evidence from a physician or registered psychologist. C, allegations of abuse by a parent toward a child without corroborating evidence. D, the past or present conduct of parents towards each other. A, primary parent. And the same thing for the Divorce Act.
Now, I'm going to go back to my list, and then those other things like the discussion about the advocate who you were corresponding with in Sweden. If you could.
Oh yeah, I went to that one first.
Okay.
Okay. There is so much research out there on why. Let me back up. The history of parenting is that in England, up until the middle of the 19th century, children were the physical possession of the father. They were the baronial desk. There weren't divorces. Mothers just gone. They had no rights to children because children were chattels. That was changed, and as it obviously should have been. That moved into the early 20th century, and by the mid-20th century, there had been a pendulum complete switch. Children were presumed almost as chattels of the mother, and fathers had no rights. Then in the 60s, 70s, 80s, as this slowly started to move and divorce became part of the culture, people began looking at what's best for kids. And there were presumptions that we all knew why moms were important, which they are, obviously. No one ever looked at that. You didn't go and get a PhD with your thesis why moms are important to kids. But what did start happening in the 70s and 80s is that people started going out and getting PhDs on why dads are important. So when I got into this game 10 years ago, I started finding all kinds of research on what it is that fathers bring to children. And there wasn't any research as to what mothers bring. There hadn't been any feeling that there should have been. Why we couldn't just have said both are important and leave it at that, would all be out of work, but we're not that smart. So there are a lot of research. One of the most fascinating pieces of research is a Swedish study that looked at thousands and thousands of people. And they looked at children measured on, I think, 25 or 28 indices or criteria, everything you could possibly think of. And which children were best, those raised in a together family, single father, single mother. And you know, if there was a 2% or 3% difference, that was significant. It's quite something. Sort of as a quick aside, the largest difference people have found anywhere in a number of studies is that fathers bring to children empathy, something like between 10 and 15% more than mothers to do. That's an amazing thing, because one would have thought that mothering is an empathetic thing. People can only guess that because empathy is something that they learn from their fathers is because mothers tend, now this is just statistics, there's always exceptions, that mothers are mothering and protective, and fathers are get out. And the analogy I use is that a child says, I want to climb this tree. And the mother says, no, 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 no. The dad says, I'll stand underneath and catch you if you fall. So fathers help kids get out in the world, mothers protect them within. And it may be that as part of that process of getting out, that the fathers teach kids where the boundaries and the borders are between you and your little young friend Harry. No, that's his toy, you leave that, you know, and if he's hurt, you help him up. Somehow, something's going on there. But in any event, to get back to this study.
I'm going to ask you to pull your jacket down, because when you leave, there we go. That's good.
So,
Oh,
what,
still-
what,
No, it's, for some reason, now that's just that shoulder, what's that, your right shoulder is, if you just,
the right shoulder?
yeah, when you lean back. It was
Is it
going
like
up.
this?
It was just going on the back.
It's
It might
okay
be
now?
fine now. Oh, if you lean back. Yeah, no, it's fine.
All right. So what this Swedish study found was that the children who did the very best were the children raised by the single father, without any exception. Now, that's not as surprising as it might sound. But if you say that what we're here for is the best interests of the kids, and if the evidence is that kids do best when they get into adulthood where they've been raised by a single dad, as opposed to the next best is the regular family, and the least best is with a single mother. Now, there's some obvious reasons for this. One is those fathers who seek and manage to obtain custody of their kids are not the average dad. First of all, they probably have to have some financial resources to do that. They have to have an incredible desire to do that. So there's something innate within them to begin with, which is going to make them a very good dad. And secondly, I think there's an unfair skewedness to the mother sample, because a lot of women who get left stuck with kids don't have the funds to do things. Would love dearly to have the father of their children more in their kids' lives. So I think there is some reason. But if, as I say, ironically, if all we're really after here is what's best for the kids, single dads are best. Now, there's another little quick story here. Several years ago in the Vancouver papers, there was a front page article of two women who lived, I think, out in Maple Ridge or somewhere, who were organizing mothers, single mothers, in a fight to get their exes, the fathers of their children, more involved in their kids' families. And I met with them, and I contemplated doing a lawsuit against some of these fathers for dollar damages, because I think you could prove that the lack of a father in a child's life, statistically, I mean, everybody knows this, the child is extremely more prone to end up as a juvenile delinquent, not have a good marriage, not get the proper education, not be able to hold work. The jails are full. The single most common denominator, every single male in jail is a bad relationship with a father or no relationship with a father. That covers them all. But they weren't too keen on it, and I basically said that if there's any hope for any of these dads to...
Oh, is that bus is...
Okay. If I decided that it really didn't make too much sense, because if there's any way to guarantee a man would never want to see his kid, it was to sue him about it.
That's a good one. Right, so I'm going to quickly, if we can cut for just one. So when we were talking to Edward Crook, he was saying that he thought there was a bias in general against divorced and separated parents. He was talking about how, and I guess this would apply to parents who had never been married. You were talking about the common law parents. How if you're married, unless there are very serious allegations of abuse, that the court can't come in, the system can't come in to remove children.
Okay, I get you.
Could you have,
Yeah.
if you could just expand on
There is a very interesting phenomenon that within the intact family, within a married family, there can be huge problems, but the state does not deem itself fit to come in and interrupt. You can, in an intact family, have parents who say to their kids, to hell with university. I know you want to go to school, but I'm not paying you a nickel. You have welfare or social workers who will come in and apprehend children who are at physical risk, but who do nothing at emotional risk. And physical harm can often be a hell of a lot less long-term than emotional harm. A parent can inadvertently get mean to a kid and break an arm. All right, shouldn't happen. Arm heals, get on with your life. But a parent who consistently demeans a child or alienates the other parent year after year after year, that child as an adult may never overcome that. The state won't get into that. Let's look at separated parents. You separate. All of a sudden the law says you have to pay for your child to go to university. You didn't when you were married, but the law now says you got to pay. You're on the hook. If this kid wants to go and get 5 PhDs, you're bankrupt. Oh, well, you know, and they will step in and award time or legal custody to a parent where the other parent is demonstrated to do something which isn't cool, shouldn't have been done, but is sometimes nothing compared to what happens in some intact families. So there is that curiosity that once you break up with your spouse, you're under a new set of rules.
Now, that's all very interesting. I think if I could get a shorter version of it so that we don't have to cut into it any, where maybe
Okay.
not expanding as much upon
All right.
the different
Okay.
types of abuse.
One of the consequences of separating is that you find yourself as a human being under a new set of rules. When you're married, you have no obligation to pay for your kids to go to school. You can treat your children basically as you want as long as you don't break arms and the welfare steps in. When you're separated, suddenly there's a legal obligation to pay for your children through as many degrees as they want to get in university. And if you dare raise a finger against a child, the other spouse is going to get custody.
And if you can also talk about the emotional, just very briefly about how
Okay.
you can't, anything that's
Yeah.
perceived as emotional.
Okay. One of the biggest troubles, in my view, as to what's going on in this entire country has to do with ministries of child welfare and social workers who will come in at a drop of a hat and seize a kid, apprehend a child if there's any allegation of physical abuse, but who will do nothing if there is absolute proof positive of ongoing, persistent emotional abuse, because emotional abuse can be much long-term, much worse on a person when they go into adulthood than physical abuse. I mean, I've never met anybody as an adult who says, the reason I'm screwed up is because my father broke my arm when I was 6. They're screwed up because of what their parents did to them for year after year after year after year, or a parent.
Now, is it true, just for my own clarification, are parents obligated to pay after their kids are 18 for
Oh, yeah.
going to school?
Absolutely.
That's by choice.
The law says that it isn't just a parent. In British Columbia, any person, it could be a stepfather or a mother's boyfriend who lives with them for more than 2 years and then separates, has a financial obligation to continue support of that child. Child is defined in a fashion that when you're 18, 20, 21, 22, and you're in university, that obligation continues. Or if the child is handicapped and is forever under the care of the parent or the mother. Now, that's the law. There are arguments to be made that you shouldn't have to do that, of course. You can raise all kinds of, maybe the young adults should look after themselves because they've got a summer job where they make a lot of money as a dot-commer. Who knows?
Thank you. Which cases end up going to court and why?
To me, there's a very simple answer to that.
And if you
The
put
man,
your mic
yeah.
forward, yeah.
The vast majority of men who come through that door have gone through marriage counseling, hasn't worked. Maybe mediation, hasn't worked. Tried collaborative law, hasn't worked. And when I get into it, within 5 or 10 minutes of hearing their story, I can ask them, okay, was your wife physically or emotionally abused or abandoned or sense of abandonment as a child? And I get, how did you know that? Because there is, and because in this case, I'm acting for the man, it is the woman, it's the mother who we're looking at, has personality disorder. As an example, take the personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. Borderline is something which comes up in women more than men, just for some reason, and in maybe 2 or 3% of women in the general population. But because of its nature of being somewhat paranoid, not rational, not conciliatory, that 2 or 3%, when they're in separation, end up being cream on top of where everybody else might have settled off, so they stay in it. So by the time somebody goes through all of this and has to come to a father's rights lawyer, however I'm perceived, there is a much higher percentage of them who have borderline personality wives. And I think it's a similar argument can be made for other types of personality disorders. So you essentially, in my practice, why is it that my clients have to go to court? It's because the women that they originally fell in love with have a tragic, and I have nothing but compassion for the situation, hole in their psyche. There is a shadow in their emotions that they fill with their children. Their children become the emotional support for themselves, and it should be the other way around. As one trial judge, who in his very first trial as a judge, had a trial I did with him, said to such a woman, "Ma'am, your children are your emotional crutch. No child should bear that burden." And so in a nutshell, that is the vast majority of the problems I see. And I'm always interested to know what would be the same kind of criticism. It's not a criticism, that's judgmental. I'm not being judgmental here, I'm trying not to be. What would be the same analysis one would give to men, fathers, who have that thing? And I do from time to time see that. Not the same kind of thing. I see in the fathers that I represent who can't let go. They may, for instance, never ever want to forgive for an infidelity. I don't know why, I've had an amazing number of fundamentalist Christian clients. And, their belief has been so violated that they just can't give it up. And that will drive them to be not compromising where they should, or not look at the fact that there's a big risk. Now, I don't know whether this is going to go on the film, but one of the things that I do is when I'm talking to somebody, if you're my client and we're about to go to court and you say, well, what are my chances? I reach down here and grab my liar's dice, and I go like that. Now, that simply gives a pair of jacks. It's not that very good. So there you are.
That's great. Now, all right. So this is one of the broader questions.
Let me carry on that. And what then becomes most frustrating is in the judicial process, there are different phases of coming before a judge that is not a trial, where they're trying to resolve it, mediate it, settle it, basically get rid of you. And these judges feel that they must sort of paint the tar across the people equally. And they sort of assume that there's equal blame on both parties for being there. There may be cases like that, but not in my experience. In my experience, we're there because there is simply an absolute refusal to move on the other side. And where I get clients who become like that, I basically stop and I won't act for them. I've had several over the last decade of men who have had such anger, so angry at what's happened, that I'll simply say, I'm not going to help you right now, because you'll end up worse off than if you just take the next year and get some good therapy and come back and be a much better father for your children than you're going to be now. And the odd one does come back, and I'll say, you look familiar. Yeah, you kicked me out of here a year ago.
Could you describe, and we're right there now, could you describe that the psychosocial journey that men go through during that process?
The Jungian psychologist James Hillman has a book out called The Midlife Passage, where I've taken a quote of his, and I put it on my website. I was so impressed with how he encapsulated this. And he basically says this, and I hope I'm not ripping it to pieces. He says that as we grow up, we make a contract with the universe. We say to the universe, I'm going to be a good person. I'm going to live the way the superego, i.e. the society, the culture, tells me I should. My parents, the school, the church, whatever. And as long as I keep my side of the deal, my life's going to be okay. And then, as part of that, you marry the girl next door or the cheerleader or whatever, you know. And as Warren Farrell so succinctly writes, you know, the boy has that kind of cowboy image of himself as seen by the girl, and the girl is the beautiful this and that, and the boy is on the white horse, and the girl is the maiden, and all this comes true, and you have a great marriage, and you're supposed to go on living in this illusory world. And then something happens. And it happens to everybody in some fashion. Maybe a loss of a job, maybe a loss of a loved one, maybe a loss of the marriage, who knows. But you get your midlife comes along, and all of a sudden, your marriage, as he says, the marital bark hits the rocks. And not only does the marriage fall apart, and this is why it is such a huge impact, breakdown of a marriage, because it isn't just that you're losing the woman that you once loved and you're risking losing your kids. It impacts your job, your family, your relationship with your friends, your physical health, your mental health. It can be phenomenal. And suddenly this contract with the universe, that if I behave right, I'll be okay. Because it is the case that while everybody contributes to these things, that there are some cases where the man actually does do his best, or the woman actually does her best, and it may be the man who has gone off and screwed things up totally. So it is often the case that one parent really can't be blamed, if blame is a word that one wants to use, and you should try to stay away from that in this whole business, because it just causes huge problems. Although, let me put this in here, when in Canada and in many jurisdictions in the rest of the world, they changed the law to make divorce possible in the absence of fault or blame, there are a lot of people who think that one should be entitled when it comes to who should care for the children if there cannot be shared custody, if there has to be the children to be primarily one parent or the other. Some people think you should be able to raise the argument about, well, who was it that collapsed the marriage to begin with? And you get a lot of fathers. I get a lot of fathers that come in and say, I don't know why she should get to keep the kids when she's the one who wants to pull out of the marriage. I want to hang in there, I want to stay. And there's some interesting research out of the United States I've got one study by some women economists who talk about why is it that the vast majority of plaintiffs are the persons who initiate a lawsuit, are the women. They go off into the financial aspect of it. But there seems to be an understanding that, by and large, it's the women who pull the plug. Now, they may be perfectly entitled to do so. There may be phenomenal reasons why they should have pulled the plug a long time ago. I'm not saying. I'm just saying that seems to be happening. One of the most difficult situations I find myself in is when a man comes in of an ethnic, like it might be Persian, South Asian, where there's been an arranged marriage overseas, and he and his wife have moved to Vancouver area, and they come in here and they say, they look very, very businesslike and very certain that they simply have to tell you what they want, and you're going to hand it to them, and you say, okay, what can I do for you? And they simply say, well, I want you to just stop my wife from leaving. And what do you mean? Well, she's decided she wants to leave me. What happens, of course, is some of these women get over here and they suddenly realize, whoa, the world's a lot more different than just being that little village in northern India or Pakistan, and I've got friends here, and I don't have to live under this dictatorial roof, and my husband's father is the real cause of all these troubles. But these guys come in here stunned that, and they dearly love these women in their own fashion, and just can't believe that there's such freedom that they can just walk, and they have a hard time getting around that.
I'd like to go back to that point that you were talking about with when the man discovered his world falls apart, his contract
All right.
his universal contract falls apart.
Yep.
And where his journey goes from there, what his reaction is.
Okay. The when these men, these fathers, and I say fathers because there's a huge difference between couples without children and couples with children. Children are the world's most valuable commodity, both socially, internationally, and personally to people. And when their world falls apart, and particularly if they sense that the mother of their children has a design to obstruct the relationship between their children and themselves, it can cause huge emotional problems. I always make sure that my clients are seeing their doctors, because you can slip into depression without even knowing it. And this has huge effect on these men, and they get mired in this. They can't let go, and it's instinctive, I guess, to want to argue back. And my job is probably 80% psychological and 20% legal. Always is to continually try to help these men through Zen tricks, if I have to use it, but to make them understand that they've got to let go. And simple things. Who cares if she thinks she's won the day? The best example I have of this is a man came in here when I first opened up 10 years ago, who looked like he literally walked in off the street, and he had in some sense. He was of East European accent, scruffy, poor, and he wanted to leave his wife and take his son with him and not give her a nickel. Well, we talked about this back and forth. And after about 20 minutes or half an hour, it suddenly dawned on me to ask him. Oh, he said, I can't sleep. I've got an ulcer. My doctor's got me on these pills. I'm sick constantly. So what do you do? How much money do you have? He was a multimillionaire. He had 2 gooey duck fishing boats. He had a little cannery over on Vancouver Island. He'd come over from somewhere in Europe, 20 years ago, made his fortune. So he had about $3 million. So at the end of it all, I said to him, listen, if I could help you get out of this and keep $1.5 million and lose your ulcer, get your health back, sleep well, would you do it? Absolutely, he said. Well, you give your wife the other $500,000. No, never, never, never. He was so tied in and bound to that. And I said, well, look, I felt like saying, you're going to have to go and see a therapist for a long time and make that disconnect. And the other marvelous story was an old guy came in once, and he had an old European suit that was a little worn. He looked like he came out of casting, a movie lot. And he had a small valise, really old 1930s type briefcase. And he sat it down on his lap, and he was talking to me about he wanted to appeal his court decision. This guy's in his 60s or 70s. My wife got everything. She got the crystal, she got the silver, she got the house, she got everything. Okay, and so finally it dawned on me, then he mentioned kids. This guy got kids? I said, well, when did this happen? He said 17 years ago. I got all the papers right here in his briefcase. And he'd put it over on the desk at that point, so I said to him, where do you live? He said, South Burnaby. I said, you got a big yard out back of your house? Yep. Could you start a fire at the right time of year out there and not get in trouble? Yes. Go home, start a fire, take that briefcase and throw it in the fire. And as soon as I said that, he grabbed the briefcase, put it across his chest, grabbed his arm, and said, "Never!" I mean, he was wedded to his misery. These are just examples. And most men have that to some extent or another to begin with. And you've got to help them abandon that, disconnect, unattach, these attachments, and to realize ultimately, the hardest trick for me to get them to realize, and the bright ones get it, is that this is the most unique opportunity in your life to find out who you are and to grow up through this and become a brand new person and a phenomenally better father for your children than you would ever have been had you stayed where you think you are now. In other words, rather than going this way into women every other night,
think that-
boo,